Hello everybody, John Motors here. I have a very special guest today, Terry Mcmahon, who has become increasingly visible to us in the last few years in Ireland, those of us who have been preoccupied with what's happening to our country. And he's manifested, so to speak, intermittently, speaking very articulately about our situation, about what it means and the depths of it. So today we're going to talk a bit about his life and his times and maybe future times. Terry, how you doing?
Good to see you again.
You're a good deal younger than me, so you've been around somewhat less time than I have, but I go back to the 50s. I don't remember the 50s, but I remember the 60s, I remember the 70s, I remember the 80s, I remember the 90s, certainly remember the 90s. You remember the last 3 or 4 of those. And in all of those times, in all those decades, the kinds of things that are happening now, and we're talking about whether it's lockdown, whether it's, the enforced coercive mass plantation, whether it's Enoch Burke, what's happened to him, the trans thing, which is related, which is the reason. Those things you think, could they have happened? When you situate yourself in any decade and think of the circumstances and the sense of reality that you had, the sense of not just your own sense of freedom, but the sense that the ordering of the society and how responses would happen. You think none of those things could have happened in those decades because there would have been a massive outcry from all kinds of places, whether it's the kind of liberal sector, the civil libertarians, the church, the retired judges, the retired politicians, even the current politicians. Within them there would be an opposition, a voice of no, no, no. And yet all these things are happening now as if all those decades had never happened. And that this kind of reduces those decades to a kind of like a sense of almost like a dream world that may or may not have actually happened. Because now those decades and the conditions that they exuded and exhibited, they're impossible in large part, in an awful lot of categories. Now, everybody won't necessarily recognise that because they're living out there in a delusional pseudo-reality. But those of us who have been paying attention must have this feeling. I certainly have this feeling all the time, and I try to figure it out, and I can't, for the life of me, understand how this could happen. Is that something that you identify with?
Well, I remember when we were young, I'm 55, so I remember the 70s, but I remember we had an obsession with privacy. Remember that? Privacy was worth more than gold, worth more than diamonds.
Yeah.
And the ephemeral nature of privacy was something to protect with your life. We relinquished it like that. Across the board, all the things that used to be important to us were relinquished so quickly, so readily, so easily, that I tried to fathom who we were then versus who we are now, and which is the lie.
That's it.
Because I look at my kids, and my eldest kid, I was saying to you, he looks at me and he looks at this kind of conversation and he just goes, why are you wasting your time? You know the government are psychopaths. You know they're not going to do anything to benefit poor people or vulnerable people or any people that doesn't benefit them. So why are you wasting your time with this bullshit? Why don't you just go and do your separate thing and create the world that you want to live in and tell them to go fuck themselves? On one level, I totally understand why he would say that. And on another level, it's a devastating indication of just how successfully they have dismantled the idea of politics to protect, government to govern, and politicians to look after the interests of the constituents. All those fundamentals that were raised are gone, been replaced with narcissistic lunatics who seem to be able to act with impunity, destroy unimaginably the nature of what it means to be Irish, the nature of what it means to have a legacy, our culture, all the elemental things that were so important to us in the 70s, the 80s and the 90s. And now we're in a situation where we're just like a satellite city of some other country somewhere. Our whole nation is nothing more than some functionary benefit to a small amount of people and bullshit to the rest.
And it's as if all the rhetoric to not use any, not in any loaded way, but all the things we heard from people in authority, of influence, of creative people, even poets, writers, all those things that we kind of heard, which were axiomatic and drummed into us, the principles, the values of our time. There might be some dispute about some of those things, but generally there was a sense of we all shared them in some degree. Like somebody cleaned the blackboard one day and they were all gone.
Well, all the things we were taught in school, integrity, ethics, actual morality,
yeah,
the principles of a spiritual life, a meditative life, an intellectual life, whatever you want to call it, an artistic life. We were told those things were the most important elements of what it means to be human and what it means to be Irish.
Yeah.
And now, not only have we erased them, but we've replaced them with idiotic ideas that make no sense to anybody, that seem to be force-fed to us by psychopaths. And that the consequence is that we don't know who we are anymore. So even today, I'm nervous sitting down here having this conversation with you. And I'm nervous because I was warned about you. I'm warned about you in what way? Suddenly you're the problem. John Waters is the problem. Anybody who questions or who dissents is the problem.
Yes.
When traditionally, and accurately and rightly so, you would have been the hero. The function of the artist was always to question those in power. And the artist never acquiesced with the government, ever. And we were brought up that way. We were rebels, proud rebels. And then to see so much acquiescence, slavish acquiescence, and then chest-beating celebration of the agreement with government is beyond comprehension to me.
That's exactly right. I mean, like the artist, it wasn't that the artist was in any way vexatious necessarily by definition. It is that the first instinct was to question and to verify and to check, to provide checks and balances so that when anything emerged, to be somewhat suspicious of it. And not to kind of start cheerleading because some powerful entity was declaring this is now, the time has come for this. But to actually start asking, well, okay, but how will it work, and so on, and to be visible and to be audible at the very outset and say, okay, I might have come to accept it, but I want to just ask these questions. That was an axiomatic part of the role of the artist, quite separate in a certain sense, but not at the same time from his or her work. It could be in his or her work as well, but it didn't have to be. It was like to be the conscience of your nation, of your people in time, isn't it?
Again, look at what we've become. Look at who we are. Artists now are too frightened to be cancelled, or too frightened to be perceived differently, or too financially burdened to stand up. Or they go to the opposite side, which to me is a lot more disturbing, where it's not based on finance. It's not based on protection. It's actually based on a tribal, screaming cowardice dressed up as heroism. And when you have a group of artists, a tribal group of artists who consider themselves heroes for being cowards, it's the death of art.
It's the death of art. And of course, part of that is a rationalization that occurs because the exigencies of your situation, whether it's your dependence on funding of a certain kind from the Arts Council, whatever it might be, or the approval of art galleries, or the approval of publishers in order to get your work into the public arena, or of bookshops to stock your books when they do come out, which is no longer guaranteed, by the way, in our society. I know this. You then create a rationalization that not alone must I do this, it's that I do this for the reason that I now approve entirely of what I'm doing, of what I'm saying, even though I'm secretly aware that I'm doing it pragmatically because I need to survive as an artist, as a human being, which we all do. When you multiply this by all of the artists, whatever number there are, just as when you multiply the corruption of one journalist with all the journalists who are corrupt now, you get a frightening situation of consensual silence on certain key issues, and then consensual position taking of a very dubious kind on lots of other things. It's a terrifying situation.
Well, that's the thing about it. If the artists, and I know I'm using the term advisedly, there's people watching this now who are hearing things we're not seeing, who are seeing things we're not doing, who are remembering things we never did. It's happening in real time. There's nothing you can do about that except try and tell the truth. And the truth is that artists are supposedly the conscience of a society, as you say. But more than a conscience, they are our inspiration. They are our substitute for a corrupt priest, for example. Not that all priests are corrupt, but there is a substitute for that idea of the facilitator, the great facilitator. So an artist facilitates in you not just a new knowledge that you hitherto hadn't conceived of, they also create within you an initially inarticulate yearning to become part of something that you can't fully pinpoint yet, but you know that yearning. That's a profound gift to society, from each artist to each of its communal members. When those artists become cowards, and we start to see their cowardice reflected in their fan base, not only is it the death of art, but it is the birth of the worst kind of cowards, because it allows them to believe that what they're doing is right. Now, so I don't mind a silent artist. I genuinely don't. And if they were all silent, I'd understand it. But how vociferous they were capable of becoming when it came to key pinpoint moments. Once you turn the right to kill the most vulnerable life form in the womb into a cause for celebration, screaming in bacchanalian delight in Dublin Castle as Leo Varadkar looks down on you like the emperor, you just go, this is incomprehensible on any level. But in terms of who we became, and that was a campaign driven massively by artists. So they're capable of stepping up and doing something collectively when required, but when it's required within a very safe structure. So the whole repeal, the 8th movement, was a very safe structure. Then the same with, you look at COVID. The artist's response, I dreamed of hearing that a building had been broken into and some artist had set up and was playing a free concert. I dreamed of just an artist standing on the street with their single instrument on electric, just playing acoustic and singing for passers-by. I dreamed of those basic things, of a poet standing somewhere that they'd broken into and reading out their poem. Not once did it happen, nowhere. And yet, but the same artist stood giving Black Power salutes to George Floyd on O'Connell Street.
Yes.
While our elderly were dying horrific deaths in old folks' homes. So when I hear about artists being selective, I think it's just even greater selective cowardice.
That's a classic example of what I was getting at there. I mean, because having grown up, most of my life in a kind of a rock and roll culture, from a teenager on, reading the New Musical Express and reading the great artists of that time, Brian Eno and David Bowie and Bob Dylan, all these guys, I thought, my instinctive thing was, well, this isn't going, the lockdown is not going to last very long, because, these guys are going to come out and they're going to ridicule it and they're going to tear it apart. Apart from Van Morrison and Eric Clapton eventually and Morrissey and a couple like that, nobody. Silence, and still silence. And the music papers that Hot Press, my own paper that I started with, was cheerleading the whole affair, and still is. Like, I honestly, I can't understand this. I know I can explain it in a certain articulate way, but in my heart I don't understand it. The whole notion of the kind of movement that is kind of what you might call art for art's sake, which has always been there, that you always said, look, the art is about art, it's not about politics. Fine. A play is a play, it's a drama of human beings. It's not messaging, it's not a postal service sending messages to people. I get all that. But what's happened now is that kind of idea has been extended almost to license complete kind of ideological kind of irresponsibility. That artists no longer feel any responsibility to anything that you might call, what could you call positive now? Liberty, justice, truth in any given situation. I mean, everything is kind of a la carte now, isn't it? Yes, we defend the right of people, freedom, we defend maverick voices, but only if we agree with them completely. We don't support Enoch Burke because he's an evangelical Christian and we don't like them. That kind of thing. Whereas once it would have been, I don't care what his religion is, he's in jail, let's get him out.
He's in jail for over 500 days.
Yeah.
He's on the run apparently, but they now want $250,000 on top of the 50 they've taken out of his account. And the silence from our so-called sector or community, whatever, is devastating.
Devastating.
I don't care if you think Enoch Burke is Hitler. The reality is that once they set a precedent where they give the banks permission ordained by the court to go into your bank account and clear it out, we've set a precedent that's going to just do untold damage to everybody across the board. And the fact that artists, the real voice, are not saying, I don't care how you feel about Enoch Burke, this is fundamentally wrong on every level. And do you not see what they're doing to us?
Yeah, and it's that whole thing. I can't remember the source of it, but it's like, they came for the Jews, and I said nothing.
Yeah.
And then, they came for the socialists, and I said nothing. And then they came for me, and there was nobody left to say anything. And that's where we're going.
I don't mind silence. I genuinely don't. But, for example, our obsessive fetishization of Gaza. We have a fetishistic obsession with Gaza that beggars belief on every level. It's something that is so far away in a country over which we have no jurisdiction, and yet we are so obsessed with it. We align ourselves with people like our Taoiseach, who claims that he can't sleep at night thinking of the dying children in Gaza. Meanwhile, there's an actual child who actually died under his watch, and he didn't give a fuck.
I think he sleeps fine.
I think he sleeps very fine. But again, you look at this and you're going, at what stage do you start to ask yourself, where did that obsession come from? And I know it's been there on and off for a while, but we talked about this before. I think it comes from a shame, a guilt, shame complex at being so cowardly during lockdown and being so acquiescent to a regime that they have subsequently discovered to be a total lie. And I think the only way they can address that is to find a surge of righteous indignation and rage activism that allows you to feel like you're making a contribution again. So they're stepping over homeless people in Dublin while they're marching with Palestinian flags for people who raped children, young girls, on top of the bodies of their dead friends at a rock concert. And we're saying that this is a wonderful thing.
Yes, and also I think it's a kind of a pseudo-patriotism. It's kind of exporting your patriotism.
Of course.
Whereas your Prime Minister, Taoiseach, can say that we shouldn't be flying Irish tricolours, but it's perfectly fine to fly the Palestinian flag.
Yeah.
Like, surely this is seeable through.
But not. I don't think it's seeable if you feel that overwhelming need to cover your shame, to sublimate your shame. You will find a passion that will be so overwhelming that it will make you feel the vigor of life again and convince you that you are part of this ridiculous phrase, the right side of history. And you look at that and you go, what have we done? Who have we become? What did we do to each other? It's not just a case of Van Morrison being the only one who stepped up. The ridicule, the viciousness and savagery of the ridicule that was heaped on Van Morrison. One of the greatest artists in the history of our nation.
Yes.
Was suddenly treated like a piece of shit.
The greatest living artist that we have.
Yeah. Treated like a piece of shit by people who couldn't even create an original song to save their lives.
Yeah.
But suddenly now they have the moral authority, the collective moral authority to say that Van Morrison is batshit crazy. Shame on them.
Yes.
We should be genuflecting at the mention of his name. And instead they're pissing all over him because he had the courage, the forthright courage and the articulation to call this shit for what it was from day one.
What you're touching on there is a very, very deep well of undertows of things that have kind of become involuted in our culture now, where you kind of have to, you're looking at things and you think, is this really happening? An example is like excess deaths. And we know, who are paying attention, that those figures, Patrick E. Walsh has told us, up nearly 20% up for 3 or 4 years, and now among certain categories, including the 15 to 25 group, it's gone up by 83% death in 5 years. Now, okay, it's a low base, but that's nearly double the number of young people dying in that period, in between 50 and 25 a year, when nobody should be dying of medical causes. Nobody, really, or very few. And yet this is happening, and it is being ignored. But moreover, there's this strange syndrome which we've seen from the beginning, where somebody dies, some young person dies, and somebody will suggest, I think that could have been a vaccination death. This person had the vaccination. And everybody becomes outraged, but the people who are most outraged are the loved ones of the person who's died. They're the ones who defend the government to the hilt. That's another strange kind of undertow of this. It's maybe there's all kinds of things in there. Guilt, maybe, a sense of responsibility that you maybe put a bit of pressure on the person. An elderly person, I'm 70, but I wasn't going to be telling my daughter or people, don't come into my house if you're not vaccinated. I certainly wouldn't do that. But some people did. So this whole plan it seemed anticipated the most malign outcomes for itself and actually weaponized them in culture in real time, in our time.
I saw a woman, a wonderful woman, and she said they're weaponizing our compassion. And she's not a woman who you would expect a comment like that to come from. But when she said it, the gravitas of it hit her, and she realized what they're doing.
Mm.
And unfortunately, I do understand. If you have lost a child, and you were part of the coercion for that child to get an injection so that child could do a bit of sports or go to a cafe or do whatever, it must be unimaginable to have to carry that with you. So you have to convince yourself that the government were telling the truth, that the pharmaceutical companies were telling the truth. Even though pharmaceutical companies are verifiably the most corrupt and most successfully sued conglomerate in the history of humankind, even though our politicians are clearly psychopaths, even though their whole track record has proven it, you still need to blindly believe that, because the opposite must be horror beyond imagine. We talked about it before in relation to the whole trans thing. To be the parent of a child who identifies as trans, whatever that means. How a child on any level is getting this information is beyond comprehension. But I understand how a parent or two parents could decide this is what's best for our child. How you can allow yourself to be so ideologically captured so quickly is beyond comprehension. But I do understand it, because now you're important. Now your child is important. Now your child feels important. Now your child is treated like they're important in school. Now all the elemental aspects that made your child slightly left of centre puts the child right front row centre. What's not to like? Suddenly you become a kind of false celebrity trio. And in the shortest time frame, you start to manifest this idea that you're doing something heroic, something magnificent, something revolutionary. And your child is part of that revolution. That's intoxicating. And then you see the damage. You can't suddenly go, I was wrong, because that's a horror too impossible to bear. You have to double down. So again, if anything, my heart breaks for people who, like the people whose son or daughter or loved ones or whatever, who did die or were vaccine injured as a result of the pressure put on them by their family. There's thousands of those families around the country, possibly more, who are having nightly conversations that are not being spoken. And they're ones of dread and terror and fear and shame and guilt and all those things. And nobody's discussing them. We behave as if COVID never happened. We behave as if lockdown never happened. We behave as if the abdication of all our fundamental rights stolen from us by a corrupt government never happened.
Yeah.
And nobody behaves with that more than artists. Where the fuck are the songs? Where are the films? Where are the plays? There's none of them. They don't exist.
No, and in fact, you know, I won't go into naming names, but I mean, we've even had a novel which, in the midst of all this, came out about a far-right coup of Ireland.
Yeah.
Imagine.
Yeah.
Like, while the cops are dragging people out of buses outside your window for not wearing face masks. And there's no far-righter there isn't a far-righter in sight. You're so right. This is, you see, it's essentially, the diagnosis you have to come to is that this is a profoundly sick culture now. It's not the only one, obviously, but we live in Ireland. But our culture is profoundly sick, and nobody's diagnosing it other than us. So everybody thinks it's normal. It's it's a normalization process. The people, the media talk about things as if nothing's happening. I know from the places I go to now, particularly recently, the people I meet, I can detect this. It's an extraordinary thing. It's like a vacuum. It's like that there's no discussion of certain things. Or if there is, they're completely formulaic. Their agenda, their narrative, faithful. Very, very economic, but it's like during the pandemic when move on. It's not like, there's no air quotes around pandemic. You would detect them if they were there. They're just not, they're deliberately not there. Even though the person in their mind and their heart knows this is bullshit, they're still not going to say it in the hearing of people who might not be reliable. So all of this is going on in our culture, and yet everybody's pretending it's not. And everybody's affected by it. They're not talking about it. So it's like you go out and people behave as if the dateline is 2004 or 1997. When things were relatively, what we might say, normal. and when you do know, then the sense of alienation from this is extraordinary, extreme. I mean, you can find yourself wanting to belong to that pseudo-reality. I do.
Of course.
You know, I want to be like these people because I love them. They're nice people.
Yeah.
You know, many of them, I love to talk to them.
Yeah.
Even when I do, I love talking about things they want to talk about, and I don't mind them avoiding the things that I would like to talk to them about. And I don't try to talk to them about those things. But it's heartbreaking to see that people could be forced into these kind of contorted positions in reality. It really is absolutely heartbreaking.
But I love the fact that you said you love them.
Yeah.
Because that's the devastating part. I'm the wall of the shit and hatred, just this wave that I'm getting of late is extraordinary from people that I love. I just had a very well-known actor who withdrew from a script of mine we've been passionately involved in for the last 2 years. It was about to go ahead, and he withdrew because of words I said in England. I just had a director, a very famous director, contact me to say how saddened he is that I'm sitting here having conversations like this. And you go, who the fuck do you think you are? The certitude, the moral certitude astounds me. Because we don't have that certitude.
No.
If anything, we're willing to put everything aside because we love people. We're willing to put any conversation to the side just for the initial engagement. We're accustomed to being attacked and we're confounded by why it's happening. We're not maliciously attacking anybody. We're not setting out to set anybody up. We're not setting out to do any damage to anybody. And yet somehow we're the fucking bad guys.
Yes. And another thing, Terry, about us is this, and this is even, in fact, the most dramatic thing, that in all the things that we know, in all the things that we say, we earnestly long to be wrong.
Oh yeah, Jesus, yes. Yearn for it. But that's the thing, it's not just that we want to be wrong. We very often are. But we admit it.
Yeah.
I'm very often deaf, dumb and blind in the dark, trying to figure out what the hell is going on. I don't mind admitting that. I don't mind being wrong. I want the right to be wrong, though. I want the opportunity to be wrong. I want other people to have the opportunity to be wrong. I want people to be able to say what they want to say and discover they're wrong as they're saying it. Or maybe discover they're wrong after they've said it, but without policing themselves or censoring themselves in advance. And that's what they want.
That's the thing that happened in the last 15 years, only, I think, to our culture. But we've almost forgotten now that the whole point of public discussion, the whole point of conversations, wasn't to assert your rightness. It was to exchange views so as you could tailor your own, maybe in response, and say, okay, like, you know, so we're having a discussion and you hear something I say and you say, yeah, well, I agree with you. I go along with a lot of the way with you there, John, but where at one point I disagree with her, maybe have you thought about this? And then I say, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. You know, and that's the whole point. People seem to have forgotten that that's the reason we have radio, television, newspapers, is to actually allow these voices to come in and be wrong. Mm-hmm. If that's what they are. Why not? What is wrong with being wrong?
But this is what this is about here. This is obviously the new television. It's what television used to be. But what worries me is that the idea of preaching to the converted. So you go, okay, there are people who are watching this. There are people who are going to be watching this just to take notes for the armor.
Yeah.
Later to put into some weapon to shoot you with.
Yeah.
Fuck off. Get a life.
Yeah.
But apart from those people, there are other people who are watching this and they feel less alone in the world because they go, they're not going mad. There are other people out there who share their same confounded capacity to be wrong. And again, I know it sounds like wordplay that we're doing, but we're not. I think the permission to be wrong is essential. Permission to be forgiven is essential. Permission to forgive yourself and to pick up where you went wrong and to try and right it is essential. Those are the elemental nature of what it means to be human.
Because in a discussion such as this, you have to have the right to think out loud.
Absolutely.
And in thinking, you're going to state things, misstate things, you're going to overstate things, you're going to understate things, and you're going to correct yourself. And in conversation, when you do that, the other party, very often, if they're not excessively polite, will correct you. And that's a good thing. That's the point of it. But that's been forbidden. And now what they do is they go in and they take out, you know, a small phrase from the middle of a sentence, and that's you. That's your whole philosophy.
Forevermore.
Yeah. and that's, you're done. That's it. And how was this permitted? Well, my theory is, one of my theories is certainly a big factor was what happened to journalism. Because, I came into journalism through hot press and through music, through writing about music. And I started off really, small, writing, reviews of gigs down around Roscommon and Longford and Sligo and Galway. And then I got to do interviews, and then I started to write, longer pieces, and I moved into other areas of media, and I wrote longer pieces. And that's how I got to be, a journalist. I was kind of almost like one of the last to got in like that, because then they set up all these, around that time, they were setting up all these colleges, and they were drawing all the people in, and they generally came from the same kind of strands of society, because they all had more or less the same grades. And there's a differential between people who come from what we used to call working class backgrounds don't necessarily, it doesn't mean they're stupid, but they don't tune in the same way as people in middle class areas and so on. And so you end up with the same kinds of people going to the same kind of courses, to the same kind of professors and lecturers and so on, and they come out unexpectedly all saying the same things. And then they go into the newspaper, and the newspaper has one view only. And if you're outside that, and that's essentially what happened to me, that eventually that caught up on me and it ejected me. Because my own colleagues started to attack me for doing the job I had been employed to do, which was express my view of reality every week. And that was suddenly unacceptable. And you have to go. And I went. I just left. I said, okay, if that's the deal, that's the deal. I'm not going to stay around here. This place is gone. The Irish Times was finished. I recognized it. But, it's an extraordinary thing that this is kind of what we were trying to escape from, I thought, by having the 60s and the 70s and the 80s in order to move us into some different dispensation where we could all openly discuss things, disagree, but not fall out irredeemably. Have intense rows, by all means. I used to have great rows with people on radio and TV, but it didn't mean we hated each other. We could go off and have a coffee afterwards, have a chat about anything. I remember Nell McCafferty, I often talked about this, the late Nell McCafferty, who was like about as hardline a feminist as you would meet. And she and I disagreed a lot on a lot of issues. We had ding-dongs on radio and TV. Afterwards, I'd be walking out the door and Nell would catch up with me and says, how's Roisin, John? How is she doing? And away we go, and we just talk there for half an hour in the street. What happened to that? What was wrong with that? I don't get it. I don't understand. You see, okay, I do get it. This is all orchestrated from the top. This is the point, I suppose, that we're not really getting to, Terry, yet. In my view, you might disagree. There's a puppet show going on, and these people think they're behaving autonomously, but they're not. They're being directed. They're being influenced. They're being weaned in different directions. I don't think people actually themselves organically decided to behave like this. There's all kinds of subtle pressures and inducements that have been introduced into culture that makes it more agreeable for them to behave like this than the way we used to behave 30 or 40 years ago, or even 20 years ago.
I think you're right. I think in terms of inducements, after World War II or during World War II, I think they did enough experiments on people under the umbrella claim that they were doing it for the benefit of humankind. But in actuality, the information they had accrued, they were going to use it to manipulate and exploit. And I think we've seen that manifested decade after decade ever since. In terms of people being created, I don't understand how colleges in general are allowed to get away with what they get away with. And then you go, okay, how does a college get away with scamming people? Because all it is an exercise in memory. Okay, the way to get away with scamming people in an exercise of memory is to try and somehow connect to the visceral, connect to the heart, connect to the instinct. And all of these woke cultures, all of these insane ideas that are manifesting across the West all came from academia. All came from bored, frustrated, megalomaniacal, quasi-emperor teachers and professors who wanted to create a world that bore no relation to reality, but was wonderful in the manifestation of their own wet dream. And now we see it across the board. I can understand why a the idea of going to college. Like you talk about the working class and the middle class in terms of their grade. And when we talk about the far right, we're talking about the working class. That's the new phrase for the working class.
Yeah.
I know they throw the odd person in there, but in general, the far right is a big fuck you to the working class. And when we talk about Gaza and the fetishistic obsession with Palestinian question, it's primarily a middle to upper class aspiration. So you watch that and you go, okay, what flags do they have? They have Palestinian flags, they have LGBTQ flags, they have trans flags. Those are the flags that are everywhere. What do the working class have? Nothing. The one group that are systematically destroyed every single day in our nation with nobody to protect them or back them up. They have one thing, they have the national flag. Let's demonize them. Let's demonize that. While all these flags flapping in the wind, let's pretend that they're all wonderful symbols of freedom. So it's very attractive to be part of that gang. It's very attractive to be part of a gang that makes you feel, again, back to that phrase, the right side of history, back to being wrong. You're not allowed to be wrong. You have to know exactly what is required. You have to be in lockstep, exactly like an army.
Well, here's the thing. I think that's exactly right, Terry. And I think that there's a very interesting thing that seems to have happened here, which is that it's not just to be right and to be on the right side of history and all. That's part of it. But more than that, and more immediately than that, to be celebrated within the culture as it is constructed. In other words, it seems like they've destroyed meritocracy. So you don't have to be great to be successful now. So long as you're obedient, so long as you're compliant, you have a good chance. You'll be helped along the way. You'll be cheered along the way. And if you're not, then you'll be cast out. And this is a terrible state of affairs where we're creating a society in which young people coming up will osmotically pick up that talent or genius are really of no value. It's obedience that counts. It's compliance that counts. That your genius might be an obstacle if it makes you unique or different.
I think it will. Not that I'm far from any kind of genius, but I think beyond meritocracy, it's mediocrity. There has to be a certain line. I remember a producer in RT, I was writing for a show there, lovely man, and he said that it was a soap opera. And one of the scenes, he really liked it. He says, but the problem is it's too good. And it sounds like a strange kind of compliment. But he says, you must understand that these people are used to eating McDonald's. They want a McDonald's burger every day. If you serve them a fillet steak, it's a really good steak, you might want steak more often. So you got to keep it at a level of mediocrity.
Oh boy.
It's chilling, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that idea of academia, again, both of us, I've worked in a lot of different universities, and some of the lecturers I met are some of the dumbest bastards I've ever encountered in my life. And they know nothing about the real world on any level. They go to school, they go to college, they get a PhD, they graduate, and they go back to teaching the college that they graduated from. And in that entire process, they barely even kissed a human being, much less have any knowledge of the inside track and what it means to be a human.
Well, it's a very interesting thing to me, Terry, and again, I'm not making any claims for myself, I'm just giving my kind of own experience, and maybe it's one shared by other people, and people far more talented than I am. But I never went to college until I was 70, which is kind of roundabout now. What I'm noticing now is something I never noticed before, and it's on Twitter. I don't do much, but I see it quite a lot. It's a very regular trope now, attacking even people like, say, Simon Harris. And suddenly I have something to be sympathetic towards Simon Harris about, which is that he didn't ever go to college, and they're always attacking him for that and questioning his right to be a minister. Well, I actually think of all the things that you might pick to find fault with in Simon Harris, the fact that he doesn't have a degree is not one of them.
Absolutely.
Like that might be his best qualification, his strongest attribute, to know what it is like to learn about the world firsthand, on the hoof, as opposed to reading it secondhand out of books and so on. Nothing wrong with books. I've read a good few books in my time, but my point is that this idea that you value the letters after somebody's name rather more than you revere the name of the person for their experience and their wisdom or whatever. That's a dangerous thing, because that's what kind of done for us fundamentally during the COVID period, which is the cult of the expert. You know, somebody who had the letters could tell you what you can and can't do in your own house suddenly. How many people are you sitting? How many people are you allowed to have sitting in your sitting room? An expert could tell you that. You had to have a degree to be able to decide that. And anybody who didn't have a degree should just shut up, because you don't know anything about sitting on sofas. You don't know anything about sofas. That's the implication. You know, this is how bad it got. For the first time, I'm going to university in ATU in Sligo. I'm doing this course in creative practice, masters. And for that I get credit for prior learning, which is my books and plays and of the past, you know. And I'm doing it as a playwright, which I was years ago. And I find it extremely interesting and helpful, and actually some of the teachers are brilliant. Most of them are brilliant, I must say. Really nice people, and I really love them, and I'm sort of in awe of them. And then I find that they've read some of my books. And I think, wow, this is kind of a source of great heartbreak to me, personally, that I live in this country for all my life, and then suddenly I'm a non-person, and I have to work to kind of find my way back in to the back door or something at 70 years of age. This country, I believe, was subject to a coup in 2011. Very silent, invisible coup, orchestrated by forces from outside. And since then, we've essentially had a singular government, even though we've had, I think, 3 elections. We've had essentially the same government, and we'll have the same government ad infinitum unless we do something about it. It's like I fell asleep about 15 years ago and I've never woken up, that this nightmare continues. And I keep trying to wake myself up and go back to the way the world was. I want to ask you in that context about your own life experience. Because I come from a certain kind of background. I can understand why I turn out a wee bit different to most people, because my parents were somewhat, unusual, let's say. Not in any bad way at all. They were wonderful people. But we didn't have a lot of money, and we lived in very basic circumstances. And my father was a very singular-minded man. He had a particular view of the world. He was, he was a postman and a mail car driver. Very, very popular in the sense that he was hugely respected. A very intelligent man. So he had a huge influence on me. And I can kind of understand that experience more or less made it inevitable that I would be the awkward son of a bitch that I am. What made you the awkward son of a bitch you are?
We share the same father. Jesus, what a question. I had a bad stammer when I was a kid. And I had messed up legs. I have a twin brother. My twin brother was 9 pounds 6 when he was born, and I was 3 pounds 2.
Oh boy.
So I was going to be thrown in the bin. And my mother was told that the big one will be fine, but this small one's going to die. So they stuck me in an incubator for a couple of weeks. My mother was sent home. Apparently my grandmother came in and looked at me and went, he'll survive. So then I had a speech impediment, very bad speech impediment. And my mother's brother had the same impediment. So she had learned from me in early age how to address it. And she would get me to stop and force me to say the words and all that kind of stuff. So you got messed up legs, which means you can't run properly without falling over, and you can't speak properly. So the two of those combined very quickly to make you feel like the runtiest of all runts. But that ends up paradoxically giving you an empathy for the outsider, an empathy for the undesirable. And then later, I was homeless when I was 15. I got a girl pregnant. And my mother and father didn't handle it too well, and I got kicked out. And I was staying on top of a derelict building, an unfinished building, and I was sleeping there at night. And I experienced for the first time loneliness, real loneliness. It was up until them just a word you read in books. And at that time, the radio station used to clock off at 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock. So there's no such thing as this constant. So you'd lie in silence and try and figure out what the hell the problem was. And then I ended up thumbing a lift to Dublin, and I got a job in a spa hotel, and I worked there, and then I moved into town. And gradually you find yourself more and more invisible in your life. So you got a job in a fish and chip shop, you did whatever. But my brother was going to school, then going to college. Everybody you know, all your peers are all blossoming, and you're vanishing more every day. So I saw an advertisement, a hand-drawn advertisement for a Dublin Youth Theatre. And I had no idea what it was, but I just knew that if I didn't do something drastic, I'd vanish. So I went to the open audition, terrified, trembling with fear. And I did some kind of fucking bullshit audition. And they accepted me. And I went back the following week again. And there's this crowd of, again, mostly middle class, but very beautiful looking, very confident men and women, like prize stock. And I was just a fucking barely human. And I could only attend it once before completely falling apart and swearing never to go again. But I met a guy there who told me about a course that was in a working class school out in the Liberties. And in Inchicore, actually, and then the Liberties. And I went to Inchicore and the Liberties. And I got expelled from the Liberties, but they brought me back as a teacher. So in the process of teaching the students, if you want to learn something, you got to teach, as you know yourself. And then I ended up getting, my girlfriend got pregnant, and I realized I had to step up. I got a job as an actor because part of RT's remit is that because it's tax paid, you have to make it open and accessible. So I got in that way. They gave me a job there. It was a particular character that seemed to ignite the imagination. I needed money, so I talked to the guy who used to write the scripts, and I ended up getting a job as a writer. So I ended up writing over 100 episodes of that show. So from there, you get to that point where you know what it's like to sit in front of a blank page, and you know how the gods can deceive you or can turn up and blow your mind. Mm-hmm. Either way, it's not your hand that's doing it. And then I realized that I wanted to make a film. And I knew I would never have the right to make a film, no birthright, none of those types of things. So I wrote a script, a crazy script, and put an ad on Facebook. Not an ad, just a post saying intend making Charlie Casanova, need cast, crew, equipment, and a lot of balls. This is sincere, so bullshitters fuck off in advance. And 174 people contacted me. They read the script, and we were on set on this tiny little budget movie. We shot it in 11 days on borrowed cameras. And it ended up getting picked up for world premiere at South by Southwest in America. Ended up being picked up by Studio Canal and distributed in the cinema and stuff. So it was like the idea of diving in to the unknown. You forget that that's probably the most important thing anybody can do. And we learn how to unlearn it later. But that was the first film I ever made, the first action I ever took to exist outside the system.
And had you like a particular fascination or obsession with film or theatre or whatever in that sense, that because you follow that line, but you made it sound like it was almost like a series of accidents.
The first play I'd ever seen was the one by Brendan Behan. The one about Brendan Behan, or by Brendan Behan. I don't know whether he wrote it or whether it was about him. I think he might have written it. Borstal, yeah.
Yeah, he wrote that, yeah.
He wrote it, yeah. So I saw that in the Gaiety Theatre. And I think I was about 17 or 18. I had to go and see it as part of the course. And I remember walking in and immediately feeling I shouldn't be here. This is not my place. Nobody in this room has anything in terms of the life that I have. And then sitting down to watch the play and being deeply uncomfortable, looking for an excuse to leave. And then the play started and going, holy fuck. This kind of alchemy is possible. This kind of magic in a fucking crowded space is possible. And leaving the building pounding, my heart pounding in my chest. And I've experienced that a few times since, thankfully. A few times not, but I would have no sense of birthright or no sense of entitlement to any of this world. So if I make it sound casual, it's not. I had to fight for every single place that I got to. Then I made another film called Patrick's Day, and that ended up being a very important film in terms of mental health and all that kind of stuff. And so suddenly everything, I was flying. And then I was stopped. I had a script, a prison script, that was ready to go, and suddenly somebody asked the wrong question. And the term asked was, is this not a bit misogynistic? And this is a screenplay about misogyny. You go, I don't understand that question, but the question was enough to cripple all of it. And it was the birth of the whole Me Too movement and Waking the Feminist movement and all that kind of stuff. So I questioned, I question everything. Back to being wrong. I question myself all the fucking time. We have got to question everything, including ourselves. But I questioned that, and for questioning that, I was punished. And then repeal come up, and I questioned repeal, and was punished further. And then suddenly you find yourself in a position where you go from being the great white hope to being the big dumb dope.
Tell me about the repeal business, because I know, and you've told me before, you and I have a different view of the fundamental, the substantive issue of abortion. You support the right of the mother to make the decision herself, and
No, that's not what I said, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, I won't try and...
No, it's okay, it's okay.
But it's a different view. So, but I'm very interested in the fact that you hold that view, and then you also qualify that in a certain way, that you, if I'm interpreting it correctly, you draw a line somewhere at what has happened since of almost, like this became almost presented as a highly virtuous thing to do, and heroic almost. And do you find that objectionable?
Not just objectionable. Again, my position on abortion, and it's open to change. In our last conversation, a couple of people contacted me and says, I can't believe you said that. They were horrified that I said it. I'm morally and ethically opposed to abortion. But am I going to stop a woman or a couple going into an abortion? I'm not. Do I think that they should have the legal right rather than the illegal pressure to do the same thing they're going to do either way? Now, so I might be morally and ethically opposed to it. I might think that it's actually arguably the worst crime you can possibly do in the history of humankind. I might think all those things, but at the same time, we've got to be capable of having two diametrically opposed positions at once and understanding both.
100%. I totally understand. I actually, I feel that position. I understand that position. Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. I have to say, given the contradictions involved in the whole issue. But the fact that you got into trouble then, having that position, and with the repeal people, is bizarre, really.
Well, one of the things about repeal, it's interesting that there's a guy who created a thing called the Repeal Shield. And at the time, like, several people had contacted me and asked me, because again, the presumption was that I was on their side. And as I said, I was asked to direct a couple of short films and give a couple of speeches on their behalf. So that was the presumption, and I was kind of the hero of the left in that regard. But in the process of asking questions, which people were invited to do, now there were some people like Lenny Abrahamson who was incredibly articulate and compassionate in his response, but others would just shut down conversation. But there was a guy who created what's called the Repeal Shield, and I discovered that 50,000 voices had been erased from the conversation through the Repeal Shield. Now, in a small little country like Ireland, 50,000 is a massive amount of voices. And what they did was, and this was again before Musk took over Twitter, Twitter would have a very certain ideological leaning anyway, so it supported this completely. But the same guy who created that Repeal Shield took a piece of a conversation out of context between myself and Paddy Houlihan on Paddy Houlihan's podcast. And Paddy Houlihan ended up getting his career destroyed. Paddy Houlihan was ejected from Sinn Féin, and for things that clearly he never meant maliciously or anything. But this fucking guy who created the Repeal Shield took this section in relation to my daughter and put it up on a page thing that he has on Twitter. And it ended up having hundreds of thousands of views, and everybody saying what a piece of shit I was. The heading was Dad of the Year. And I contacted him and I said, look, for the benefit of my daughter, please take that down. You're causing untold pain to a girl who has nothing to do with anything here. Whatever I was wrong, I will say I was wrong. Whatever you need me to do or say, I'll do. But just please take that down in relation to my daughter. He reveled in it. He loved the power, refused to take it down. Now, I found out through a friend of mine where he lived. And I'm a very nice fella.
I know that.
Until I'm not. And this guy has no idea how close he came to getting badly hurt. And when I went that close to it, I realized there's something really dark happening here. And you'll end up going to jail for doing damage to somebody on behalf of your daughter, and she's going to have her father in jail. And suddenly realizing that there's a primal malice in trying to defend the indefensible. And when you convince yourself that it's heroic to kill unborn children, you've crossed that line into the realm of malice required to justify anything. So I've had that experience a few times. I've had that kind of public evisceration, that public humiliation, that public whatever. And it's seems to be part of what we do here, It seems to be an inevitable outcome of opening your mouth.
Well, it's that if those who are not with us are against us, to the power of 1,000, there's no room for variation. There's no room for subtlety. There's no room for gradations of, commitment to any idea or not. It's like you either agree with everything we say. That's a critical aspect of the woke mentality, that you can agree with 99%, but what's the problem about the last 1%?
Yeah.
And that makes you as much a pariah as if you agreed with nothing.
Yeah.
We've seen that in time and time again with, say, George Hook when he spoke about. He was called out on his radio program talking about, when he was at News Talk, about a girl, being raped in O'Connell Street, and saying, well, something to the effect that, well, if that was my daughter, I would have told her not to go out dressed like that, or whatever it was. He was saying a commonsensical thing, but it was, of course, spun in a certain way. Oh, so you're dictating how women should wear, what should wear, and so on. So it's like, and he'd signed up to pretty much everything, like the repeal. He had signed up to gay. He's signed everything, and that he still got cancelled.
Yeah.
So, like, it's all or nothing. And this has been another symptom of where we are, like that only the fanatics remain, and boy, do they make a lot of noise.
But also they're a tiny minority, and yet they're treated as if they are the vast majority.
Yes.
And conversely, we are part of the vast majority, and we're treated as if we're fringe lunatics.
Yes.
It's a very, very strange thing.
Well, that was the thing that occurred to me, in that night we spoke before, on the 1st, I think, of November in Castlebar at Mishera. This room full of people, and you and Patrick E. Walsh and John Wedger and Suzanne Delaney and all these guests, and we had the kind of democratic discussion that this society used to have and has lost, which everybody should actually look at and see, oh, this is what it used to be like.
A great night, by the way.
Fantastic, yeah.
Because we remembered laughter, shouting, cheering, jeering, everybody going toe-to-toe, but afterwards drinking and loving each other.
And this festival was condemned as far right before it even was born. And the feeling I had looking at that room as you were talking, as the others were talking, is these are the Irish people. This is Ireland. This is Ireland as it was, as it still is, if it was allowed to speak of itself. And yet it is completely suppressed by a corrupt press, by a tyrannical government, by, all kinds of invisible forces. And people are just terrified to open their mouths in public. There, suddenly, people felt free to say things they wouldn't have dreamt of saying outside their own homes, and even sometimes not within them. It's a really shocking moment when you can see the past and the present in the one space, and you realise that actually, here we are, everything inverted, everything turned upside down, everything perverted. So in the second part, I'd like to talk to you about the future, and if any, I also have to enter that caveat. Shouldn't, but I do. There's something that has been in my mind recently about your trajectory, that it seems that you are, by whatever inexorable forces, you're being driven towards some form of leadership role, whether inspirationally or maybe more literally. I don't know, but maybe you'll talk to us about that. I came across your manifesto recently, where you, in a particular discussion with a particular individual, you set out a kind of a manifesto for how you would lead, what you felt was necessary. And it was an interesting and novel approach. Indeed, there's probably no other, as far as I know, of real strong proposal for how we go about changing our country out of this rut that it's in. And you emphasise very much the young people, involving them. You use the word revolution very interestingly, in a particular way, democratic revolution. And you talked about the importance of media, of communication and so on, which is a particular thing of yours. What do you think is necessary most urgently in our society in order to begin a process? Do you think it's possible in the first place? And what's the first thing we need to address?
Schools. Got to clear out the schools and the universities. Universities, when we were kids, to go to university was the most sublime aspiration there was. And it was an indication of, forward momentum and social hierarchical climbing and all that stuff. But it was also a magical place, a majestic place, a place where you go in to experience the unknown, a place where you'd be blown away by the intellectual rigor of the lecturers and your fellow students. And you would have an explosion of realization after realization about the profound insights into the world that you hadn't considered before. That's how I envisaged the university. It's a far cry from that now. Now it's driven by commerce and ideology. And if we have, again, I keep on using the phrase because I can't think of anything better, but if we exist in a society where we think it's heroic to convince children that they're born in the wrong body, and then consider it even more heroic to secrete them away from their parents and discuss adult sexuality with them like it's our secret, and how wonderful they're going to be when they finally find the courage to embrace the alternate self. What the fuck are these teachers doing having any of these conversations? What are any of these lecturers or teachers or anybody in positions of authority or power or education doing having these conversations? And instead of us asking that question, we're damned for asking it. The teachers are protected. The Irish National Teachers Organisation, they recently sent their Rothweiler lawyers after a newspaper printed an article, an interview with me. She's a woman from England who came and lectured the Irish National Teachers Organisation in Wexford at their annual gathering. And she stood there and she said, I'm paraphrasing, but it's effectively what she said. The video is available on YouTube for anyone to look up. Ellie Barnes is her name, Dr. Ellie Barnes. And she addresses the Irish National Teachers Organisation and tells them, don't be telling the parents what you're teaching the children. You're going to get 24 angry parents arriving. Nobody needs that. So she actually told them to lie to the parents about what they're teaching. And then she told them how to lie most effectively, and then explained to them that it's now policy, so they don't have a right to question whether or not they should be lying. And not a single dissenting voice in the room, not one teacher raised their hand to say, what the fuck are you talking about? So when we have children, and the parents of children convincing themselves that children can be born in the wrong body and be considered heroic for having surgery on that poor, vulnerable body, we're not going to be able to get anywhere. So I think it starts with the education system. And the recognition that this bullshit, fallacy, lie, fantasy, fetish, call it what you will. And again, if somebody identifies as trans, that's fine. If an adult identifies as trans and they want me to call them whatever they want me to call them, no problem. I won't be compelled to speak in a certain language, but no problem. But when you have adults who are using an ideological cancer to get to children, even the gay rights movement, at its very, very height, at its highest power, the gay rights movement always knew you do not go near the children. That was the absolute bottom line across the board. And for some reason, this umbrella bullshit came about and they went straight for the children. And they have captured the children, and worse still, they've captured the imbecilic, ideologically driven parents to convince themselves and each other and their community that somehow they're heroes of the revolution.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary to think that we went from a kind of a panic in relation to child abuse, and I mean, in some respects very much justified panic, but we went from that and emphasising that to the direct opposite, almost overnight, where suddenly the very same people who have been warning us about paedophilia and child abuse and so on, suddenly we're telling us it's okay for drag queens to go in and talk dirty to children. And then that with all these books with all these kind of bizarre sort of so-called lessons for children, which is none of their business. They don't need these until they grow up. But this idea that this is somehow, I suppose the logic they would use is something like, oh, well, we don't want them falling into the hands of prudes and people who would suppress their sexuality and blah, 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 this sort of stuff. But what I can't understand is how this suddenly flipped overnight. And the same people were out again saying the direct opposite of what they've been saying before.
But again, look at the same people who claim to be our moral guardians or our moral authorities are the people who are allowing the highest number of homeless children in the history of the state to unfold exactly parallel to their claims of protecting children. So it's very obvious to, call out their bullshit by proving they don't give a fuck about children. Whatever they're using children for, whatever their agenda is in relation to using children, I think in time to come we will look back in horror while we have some government ordained investigation that will yield very little and accept the promise it'll never happen again. I think we'll have an investigation of how we allowed a tiny group of ideologically captured degenerates destroy a generation of children.
That thought is a very comforting one, very reassuring one to hear. And a part of me wants to believe that. But another part of me chirps up saying, no, it's over. We're never going to get back that sanity. How would we? Because you talk about the education system and you're right. That's the foundational. But nevertheless, in the immediacy of culture, every day, every hour, media is in another sense the primary problem. Because that's what's feeding into the culture, all the oxygen that keeps this stuff going, and vindicating and validating what these people are doing and giving them air cover so they can get away with their scummery. And those who question them can be condemned. I remember a library down in Dean's Grange or somewhere like that a few years ago cancelled Drag Queen Story Hour thing, and the Irish Times carried a headline, Drag Queen Story Hour cancelled due to homophobia. That kind of thing, like, it's disgusting. How do we move on all these? What does it take? Because you talk about revolution, and I think that document that you issued to Captain Kelly, but it's a very interesting. I mean, I agree with you. Revolution is, but I would say velvet revolution, like they had in Prague. That's what I feel we should be working towards. What they had in Prague in 1989, where you had, and the pictures are online and they're astonishing. Because what jumps out at me now about those is the contrast between those crowds, 1 million people in Winchester Square and the surrounding streets, and the balcony on the town hall at the top, and Havel and all of these people coming out. And the people jumping in unison, like literally jumping for joy. Not a single sense of aggression, violence, antagonism, nothing. Just beauty. How far are we from that?
Well, again, let's play devil's advocate or even just look at the paradox. The Velvet Revolution, Václav Havel was an artist, a great artist, brilliant writer, great humanist. So you had an artist leading the revolution. But the second thing we must remember is that the people who are involved in the trans movement believe that theirs is the Velvet Revolution. That what they're doing is the Great Awakening, the great civil rights marches of their time. And that's where it's interesting, because it's not that I believe anyway, most of them are not going out to maliciously attack people. They believe, again, to use that phrase, that absurd phrase, they believe they're on the right side of history because they're demanding history unfold in front of us in the present. So their indoctrinated fundamentalism is a badge of honor, is again, velvet revolution. So when we talk about these terms or these phrases, we've inverted the meaning of everything, subverted the meaning of everything. So now compassion is killing a child in the womb. Love is cutting a child open and creating an orifice in them for a vagina for the rest of their lives. What have we done to language? What have we done to meaning? What have we done to the idea of words like revolution? Now, I think that the politicians, we know they're psychopaths. It's easy to identify that now. But the people who are trying to do the right thing and believe they're doing the right thing, I think if it's possible, a unification between disparate groups of people who we have long since believed are divided for good might actually be the answer. That if we start to turn around and look at each other and go, we're both being played, we're both being turned into hostile creatures against each other, and let's look at the basics. The basics are children are off the table. If we have to sit down and have a discussion about why children are not allowed to be part of this conversation, we're all in trouble. Surely you can realize, anybody can realize, apart from the most degenerate pedophile, anybody can realize that you do not allow children to be part of adult conversations, particularly ones that are going to severely adjust and destroy their body, their autonomy, their mind, their sense of self.
Of course, the point you make about the trans people thinking they're on the right side of history, well, I mean, this is the nature, I suppose, of revolution. You know, that all revolutions in a certain sense start out of idealism of some kind. Like, say, so the Soviet Revolution in 1917 started in that spirit, overwhelming the Shah, the previous regime, and you know, evening out all of the injustices and so on that had accrued in Russia and up to that point. But then, very quickly, the germ of corruption enters in, and within, you know, 15 years, you have absolute tyranny at play, and this seems to be the problem. And you know, so in a certain sense, even in Prague under Havel, I mean, nothing like terrible happened like that. But nevertheless, if you read on to the end of Havel's story, you know, he's to the castle and back, where he writes about his frustration about
He wasn't well liked by the end.
No, he wasn't, and also he was frustrated because he was in this job, president, but he had so many kind of nonsense, bullshit jobs to do that he hadn't time to do what he wanted to do and to create the kind of context of post-political politics, which had been his dream. And in the end, although he didn't say so explicitly, he more or less said implicitly that that's not possible. You know, he was talking about, you know, we need post-political politics, by which he meant to create clubs in every town, city, where people who are interested in their society can go and become involved, so that they have the resources that are necessary to make a statement, to make an impression, to move among fellow like-minded people, whether it's, you know, photocopying, the internet, whatever. You have all these services there, and out of that can come a new kind of awareness. Now, you know, it's a bit vague, a bit kind of woolly. But in principle, it sounds like an improvement of what we have, where you have like cabals of, you know, people taking over parties and using them in a certain way and buying them and so on. But, you know, he at the same time, he had to admit defeat. And I mean, the end of Václav Havel was really deeply, deeply sad, because he died alone in his holiday home, where he'd been for some weeks, completely on his own, and the only people he saw were the nuns from the convent up the road who came with his meals every day, and they found him dead. You know, when you think about it, Terry, you know, a guy who had been feted by all the rock stars of the world, and, you know, Paul Simon and U2 and the Rolling Stones and all this, and now here he is, this extraordinary genius, hero, lying alone, dying in his bed. What does it say to you about idealism? What does it say to you about hope? You know, the world, like, in the end, we all die alone. Don't we?
And are we going to regret on our deathbeds our cowardice?
This is the point.
He didn't have to have that.
No, he didn't.
And that's the difference. Dying alone is not a problem unless you're dying alone afraid. He didn't die alone afraid.
No, he had a great belief in the meaning of reality.
And he tried.
Yeah.
He tried, goddammit.
Yeah.
It might not have worked, but he tried.
Yeah.
And his work still exists. Read his material. Some of his plays are masterpieces.
Yeah. Yeah, he found a way of writing about these circumstances without it being blatantly obvious.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think, see, that's an interesting thing, Terry, about that revolution, the Velvet Revolution. It had deep roots going back in time. In the people involved at the top were mostly artists, poets, such kind. And that's the thing about Eastern Europe in general, which for some reason, maybe it's an obvious reason, it's got to do with totalitarianism and its deep roots in Eastern Europe and so on. But that kind of mentality that was in the theatre and in the arts in those countries was completely different to what it's like in Western Europe, isn't it? Like, for some reason, even at the best of times, our arts and our culture were constructed in such a way as to kind of protect them from political responsibility, and that's a crude term, but from social responsibility.
But again, it's that thing where the idea of the artist, again, I'm using the term advisedly, I know some people go shut up, but whether or not you think you're any good or not, that's a separate conversation. But if you're called to be an artist, it was one of the highest callings there were. You were looking at it, you yearned to be part of an astonishing group of people who had the capacity to transcend the limitations of reality and envisage a future that is a profound gift to all of us. That's a level of alchemy that's incredible. That's a level of magic that still exists. So to yearn to be an artist and to be yearning to be a part of the community of artists was the noblest of aspirations. Until we found ourselves in a position where now to be an artist means you're just a propagandist. And if you're a propagandist, I got no problem with advertisers are propagandists. But we all understand that the advertising business is a whorehouse. And in that whorehouse, whatever happens, happens, but at the end of it, we get this titillation of a minute. Art, cinema, television, theatre, novels, everything across the board, they were supposed to be always something entirely different. Their power to transcend our sense of our own limitations and create within us an aspiration to something higher. That was sacred and was always considered sacred. It's not anymore.
Yeah, I think one of the great misunderstandings that they've managed to plant is this idea of politics. Of course, in peacetime, artists don't go on about, elections or Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and all that stuff, unless it's somehow a backdrop to whatever else is happening. But in extremis, in times of profound crisis, such as we are in now, and such as Havel found himself in then, and such as Czesław Milosz and these guys, and Solzhenitsyn found themselves in, and were motivated to act and to speak and to write out of that, and to become engaged. In the West, artists are still hiding behind that superficial notion that politics is not the stuff of art, whereas in certain conditions, it's the only stuff of art.
But again, they're very selective. This is my problem. They're very selective about when they're willing to step up. So again, we talk about our obsessive, fetishistic engagement with Gaza and the Palestinians and the Jews in Israel. Every Irish person, it seems, is an expert on that conflict. Every Irish person has not just skin in the game, but wants to rip their clothes off and scream in activistic rejection. What are you talking about? Look in front of you. Look who you just stepped over to continue your monologue about Gaza, a place you've never been to, with people you've never met, never will.
Yes, your own country faces an existential threat and you don't know it.
And we're not only you not know it, but you're wantonly distracted and loving the distraction. It's like, you got to make a meal or you got an ice cream. Gaza is the ice cream. And we are just gorging on this ice cream and the meal is not getting made. And the food is rotting. And this is going to cause serious damage. And we're still busy screaming about how beautiful the ice cream is. It makes no sense on any level.
Terry, this is a kind of a tricky question, but I want to just talk about myself and a little bit and about you. I mean, I have been involved in this. And one of the things I resent is the way people constantly describe me as an activist, when they know perfectly well that what I am above all is a writer. And I always have been. And that my function in this, and the reason I became embroiled in it, was to do with being a writer, and that was my voice. And out of that then came certain actions, not activism, I would say, actions necessary to do at a certain time, because taking illegal action, for example, constitutional action against the lockdown, for example, that kind of thing. Being involved in referendum campaigns over the years, that kind of thing. Because there are certain moments where I think the responsibility of the writer or the artist or the poet, or whatever it is, the uncreated conscience of our race, as Joyce talked about, and whatever that means. So I stepped up, and then my life is kind of no longer my own, and I'm involved in these things that maybe sometimes I don't necessarily feel identification with, but yeah, it's part of what it is. And I wonder how you deal with that. Now, people sometimes say to me, well, would you become the leader of this or the leader of that or whatever? And I have a great excuse. I'm too old. Now, Trump is kind of somebody who causes problems for people like me who do that, because Trump is older than any of us, and still he's doing it. You're a lot younger. I kind of think it's inevitable that you will find yourself drawn into this kind of role as time goes on, because you stand out. And I'm not blowing smoke up your ass. I'm just saying that it's obvious to me that your voice, your imagination, your sense of language, your understanding of the nature of the events that are happening and what is necessary. And again, I go back to that manifesto you wrote for Captain Kelly, which is, in a very stark and simple way, sets out the foundations, I think, in a kind of new way. You know, you're talking about young people, you're talking about the gentle, you use the word gentle several times. That it's like the Velvet Revolution. It seems to me to be coming from the same place. Do you think that's kind of an unavoidable fate of yours?
I think the first thing that should exclude anybody from getting into a position of power is the desire for that power. So the last thing in the world I want to do is be a politician. Good God, I can't think of anything more miserable. And the last thing I want to do is be the leader of anything. I'm a director, I've directed films. That's not a leadership as such, that's a facilitation. But I have been courted before. I've been courted a few different times from a few different groups of people. One of them was for the presidency, which was interesting at the time. Very interesting conversations with very good people, very powerful people. And the way the subsequent election unfolded, they were tearing their hair out because they hadn't gone further with it.
Was that the recent contest? Yeah. Okay, that's a pity.
What I do is I tend to meet everybody. I'm not going to be told who I can and cannot talk to. And there's certain people who were very upset with our conversation in Mcmahon.
Really?
Certain people who were very upset with, you mentioned this Kelly guy. I don't know whether your listeners are aware of him or not, but just very quickly to address it, because I didn't want to address it because I don't want to give it any space, but he's a kind of a Walter Mitty character who I was asked to speak to. And again, I speak with anybody whenever I want. I won't be told who I can and cannot talk to. And we had a series of conversations, and he was asking me questions and I was simply answering the questions off the cuff. And over the course of those several hours of conversations, that email that he subsequently published publicly, I sent to him. So it wasn't a manifesto as such, it was just a very simple and very deliberately simple breakdown of some of the necessities of what it would be to create a sense of a viable alternative government power. Because that's part of the problem, is that we can't differentiate anymore between that which can be versus that which is. And I wanted to find a way of quickly asserting who we were, based on the legacy of our nation, based on the future of our people. And unfortunately, he ended up being a shyster. And that's not the first shyster I've encountered. It's not the first meeting I've had with somebody who wanted me in some leadership role that ended up being a waste of time. It's disappointing every time. It's publicly humiliating because and I don't regret anything I wrote, but at the same time, it's a private conversation. And it also gives, bullets to people who want to shoot you.
And it was a negotiating position, as it were, as I understood it anyway.
Yeah, but it was also a case of, I don't know whether this guy is full of shit or not. So I'm going to roll the dice to find out whether or not he's full of shit. It's not a case of me sitting there going, okay, I'm going to have some intense negotiation based on me sweating over nothing like that. It was just throw it away, throw it all out there.
Yeah.
And part of it was to make sure that, because at the time, that guy was Gavin, was his name, who was running for the presidency?
Yes, Jim Gavin, yes.
Jim Gavin. And they had revealed that he had withheld information about his tenants when he was a landlord. So part of it was me saying, I'm going to put everything on the table there. I'm going to let you know my whole fucking world. I'm going to let you know with total transparency, so down the line, you're not going to go, you never told us this. So you take that risk in a private conversation, and so it needs public. Anyway. So in terms of leadership, I'm terrified of the future. I'm terrified of most things these days. I was even terrified sitting down to have this conversation, because everything you do seems to generate an immediate series of attacks. And the support is beautiful, but the support is always private and the attacks are always public. It's really interesting to see it. And the people who attack you the most savagely are the people who were the most silent when our nation fucking needed them most. And that's devastating as well, because again, these are what you said earlier, these are people you love. Some of these are people I adore. But then you see someone like Van Morrison and you go, One of the greatest artists in the history of our nation, at the time when it was most required, stood up and was a warrior. If Van Morrison can do it, you can fucking do it.
Yeah, yeah. You said that you got a backlash, I think, towards our conversation in Castlebar and Machiera. Now, last night I went through it all again just to make sure we didn't go over the same ground exactly again. And it seemed to me to be unexceptionable, in the sense, not unexceptional, but unexceptionable. What could possibly people find objectionable in it?
But again, that's what I told you. People are hearing things now that we're not saying. People are seeing us do things that we're not doing. People are witnessing events that are not taking place. I don't know how you respond to that.
Is it that it's almost that you have to, as in a show trial, you have to state certain things categorically, and if you don't, then you're hanged. Well, you're hanged anyway.
It's the old fucking bullshit, ABC always be closing, but also the advertising adage. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them what you just told them.
Yeah.
So that idea, the triadic pattern, the constant, there's no room for nuance. There's no room for, again, back to being wrong. There's no room for, like, it's interesting that we're the ones sitting here having an uninhibited conversation, a transparent conversation. We're doing this having no knowledge where the conversation is going, but we believe it's in good faith.
Yes.
We're the ones putting ourselves out on the table, buck naked, and these are walking in with their fucking hatchets,
they're
cutting off limbs and checking the limbs and throwing it back, saying it's a dodgy limb. And you're looking at them going, what is it you're doing? What, of all the people in our culture and all the people in our society to be attacking, the fact that two gimps like you and I are fucking top of the heap is absurd.
It is a bit, yeah.
Where is all this misguided rage when it comes to the people at the top? Suddenly it filters out very fast. Well, suddenly they become inarticulate.
Well, this is the thing that amazes me, Terry, in relation to what we call the resistance. You know, I've been accused of being a Freemason, for example, which is the most laughable thing that I can possibly think of, you know. For example, that's just one thing. By people who don't seem to have a lot to do with their time, and they're claiming to be on our side. I say, why don't you attack the government? Why start attacking people on ostensibly your own side? But then that brings me to the kind of point. You just then wonder, the next thing is wonder, are these people planted there for precisely this purpose? Is this infiltration? Are those responses that you received all orchestrated in order to deter you and scare you into a new silence?
Well, I would suggest it's even scarier than that. So I keep on hearing this phrase, controlled opposition. Apparently I'm controlled opposition. I'm also a Freemason, but I am a Freemason, just so you know. Whatever handshake I need to give you.
Yeah.
I don't know what a Freemason is, much less be one.
No.
But again, I am a Freemason apparently, and I am all these things apparently. But I think the greatest and most disturbing form of abuse is when the abuser doesn't have to be around anymore for you to abuse yourself. And I see a lot of these people, they are so obsessed and passionately obsessed with doing the right thing that the lie would be so easy to believe if it justified the trajectory that you're going on in terms of your rage. So whatever somebody says that you're a Freemason, I don't know whether you're a Freemason or not, that's your business. But if someone says you're a Freemason and it gives them currency in that tiny little moment of the reveal of this information, they are suddenly powerful. They are suddenly now part of the activism. And you go, no, you're not. Not only do you know it's nonsense, not only do you know that what you're doing to yourself is damaging, but your addiction to it is totally in service of the people in power. So that's why, like, one of the things, it's interesting to see our Minister for Finance jump ship there the other day, Pascal Donoghue, for a 600 grand a year job. But when you're watching him, his last big action was when that little boy died of scoliosis and our Taoiseach vanished like the coward that he is. Who came out and spoke in his defence? Pascal Donoghue. So he had to fall on the knife. He had to do one last act, whatever it is. He had to say the unsayable. He had to speak the unspeakable. And he had to defend a man who let a boy die. And his response was, nobody cares about children more. I've never met a man who cares about children more. So we know he's lying. He knows he's lying, but he's playing it. It seems to be the last action he's doing in government. Now he's gone. He's replaced by who? The same man that he defended. Now, it's not a case of college that you mentioned earlier. I don't think college is the issue. People say he's never had a fucking job a day in his life. Never worked a day in his life. Now he's the Minister for Finance and the Taoiseach. He never worked a day in his life. So when you see those things unfolding, it's almost impossible to attack that. So it's much easier to go, John Waters is a Freemason. John Waters is controlled opposition. John Waters is fill in the fucking blank. Because now you feel like you're part of the world, as opposed to this one, which is untouchable.
I had a terrible experience there a couple of minutes ago, Terry, when you said you don't know whether I'm Freemason or not. And then I realised that I had my hands joined like that.
Yeah. There's all these shit.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Listen, I'll join the fucking Freemasons.
I'm going to have to get these hands cut off or something. You know?
Yeah, that's the only thing you deserve.
They keep doing stuff without me even knowing what they're doing. You know, they just seem to like winding me up. But it's just a thing struck me there when you were talking, Terry, there, that, you know, we're in this awful situation, like where all of these things are happening to us now, and we're in the like, you think about the future. Oh, you think of all of these psychological tricks that are available now, all this propaganda, all of this kind of, like, how can we cleanse the world of all the kinds of things that are able to make this so easy to do? Which seems so. I mean, I take your point about the education system. My point about the media. But before that, there is all of this voodoo available now to powerful people through channels that really are impossible for the ordinary person to check or interrupt or control in any way, even in their own lives, never mind in their children's lives. Like, the world is in deep, deep shit going forward, unless these issues are addressed. And in effect, it seems to me, and I don't like talking about banning anything, but it seems to me that things like behavioral sciences, psychology, all these sciences, which have many good aspects, have created so many problems in the world, and are so difficult to counteract, that we may have to really seriously think about them, in the same way as there are certain kinds of technology that if we, whoever we will be, ever get control, whatever that means, of whatever, we need to say, well, actually, that technology is not conducive to the betterment of the human species, and therefore it should be buried in a 20-foot hole. The world has kind of slipped ahead of the human race in ways that we don't seem to be able to pull back. Like, there are certain of our number who seem to have kept pace with technological developments and to acquired ownership of it. And now they're in the position of being, in effect, God on earth. Mm-hmm. Or
it's interesting. I love the way you phrased it there, but the slipping ahead of the people. But if we're going to get simple and stupidly simple, ban sugar, ban pornography, ban counsellors. I think the three of those combined are doing more damage on a daily basis than all the other shit combined. I think counsellors, psychiatrists, psychologists, child psychologists. Again, I know some counsellors, and there's a couple of them are superb, but most of the rest of them are people you should never let near a child, much less an adult. Those people came from, again, back to World War II and back to studying human nature in relation to the claim of helping it along, but in fact using it, Stanley Milgram, all these kind of things. But when we look at children now, children are told from the earliest age that their vulnerability is weakness as opposed to complex. They're told that their weakness has an immediate fix if they agree to this, that, and the other. So the pharmaceutical companies' wet dream is from the cradle to the grave. Have us on everything from the cradle to the grave, even before we come out of the mother. So you have children now who are trained in how to blame, trained in how to negate all responsibility, trained in how to fetishize their own emotions, trained in how to scream and wail and throw a tantrum if they don't get what they want, by somebody who has them on the hook for 120 quid twice a week for the next 10, 20 years if they're lucky. It's not in the interest of child psychologists or psychiatrists or psychologists to fix anybody. It's like Weight Watchers. If Weight Watchers worked, they would be out of business. We are telling children that their fanciful, small, personal, self-aggrandized ideas of self are the single most important thing in the history of humankind, and everything else can go and fuck itself. It's idiotic nonsense. But we're creating a bunch of ill-equipped narcissists who will turn and blame their parents for everything they ever gave them, and will find reason in society to either hook up to a prescription drug or an illegal drug.
Yeah. Generations that are actually terrified of everything, of living, of dying, of everything in between.
But also been told that their terror is somehow a great characteristic. This is the point I'm making, is that I'm being slightly facetious about the sugar and the porn and the counsellors, but that idea of, you put the three of those together and look at the damage they do on a daily basis across the world, and the damage they do in the pretense of pleasure. So the damage the sugar does to your entire system, the damage that pornography does to your entire soul, and the damage that these crazy fuckers do to your mind. The three of those combined are destroying us.
It's like as if, that the human desire is completely misunderstood at some level in our culture. And that, because there is a kind of an iron law. I think St. Augustine expressed it in the phrase, everything eventually turns to disgust. What he meant by that was that everything that attracts us, we get too much of. It disgusts us. So that the desire of humanity is never satisfied. It's incapable of satisfaction in itself. Therefore, as he said, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, which is the fundamental religious idea, I guess.
But even, let's go back even a step further. The mother of my kids, she's a lactation consultant and a midwife, and an amazing one. She's brilliant at her job. But every day there's women in the hospital who should be having a natural birth and are not having a natural birth because of time constraints, because somebody has to be at the golf course at 3 o'clock. And those children have been cut out of their mothers. The entire birthing process, the most vulnerable life form, has now been replaced by the most mechanical and medicinal birthing process. And the damage that it does is incalculable. And women, the first thing they do, they're handed a bottle, milk made out of powder, by the same pharmaceutical companies who are selling us the other shit. How is anybody giving a man-made powdered milk to a newborn baby? And yet not only is it done every day, it's suggested that it's somehow more beneficial than breast milk.
Yeah, and then you have the injections still going on, which, despite the fact that out there's a growing consensus and chorus of people who say these are extremely dangerous.
Of course.
And doing severe damage to children.
Well, why would anybody want to do that to their child?
But, you see, Terry, you understand this, but let's spell it out, because it's such a trap. The parents, unless they're very well briefed themselves and understand, and even when they are, there's always a sense of risk in eschewing the vaccine and saying, no, we'll go it alone. Because it's not even just the social aspect that, they'll condemn you for having failed to vaccinate your own children because they're therefore a risk, blah, blah, to other children and so on, which is nonsense, as has been established. But there's also the fact that, there's almost a superstition arising in the mind and the heart of parents on account of the consensus that surrounds them about these issues. So that at some level, it's totally irrational. They become terrified. Well, what if my child then gets mumps or measles or whatever and I haven't vaccinated, and then something terrible happens? They, in this situation, feel that in a certain sense it's preferable to take the vaccine, and if something goes wrong, then it's not their fault, really. It's the people who created the vaccine, it's the state, it's whatever. You need an extraordinary level of knowledge and independence of thought as a parent to be able to go through with what is involved in making the decision to say no. And the research is there. The research is there now to show, there's been research between vaxxed and unvaxxed children, which shows clearly that those who are unvaxxed have much less illness than those who are vaxxed. It's absolutely established. Del Bigtree was the guy who funded it and pushed it. And he got some scientists, independent scientists. He went deliberately for people who were pro-vaccine, and they did this research, and this is what they found. And they were honest enough in the end. They didn't want to publish it, but they did. So the facts are there. The facts are in. And yet the culture is still in place around the head of every parent, every pair of parents, you know, faced with this dilemma, do I not, and do I or do I not? And then they're subjected to the coercion, the soft, passive-aggressive coercion of the professions who surround newborn mothers. And they're trapped. And so they have to just cross their fingers and go on.
That's hell. What you described there is hell. And again, you're talking about the facts being in. The facts were in about our Taoiseach and what he subjected that poor child to as he died a horrible death. And his parents started a campaign of truth. All the facts were in. And then suddenly somebody makes a bomb threat. And suddenly he and his little children are the victims. Suddenly the whole narrative is switched in a half a second.
Yes, quite convenient.
And that's us. That's our addiction to soap opera. We whatever is new, we are like a cat. And the fact that we have allowed these psychopaths, and they are verifiable psychopaths, easily diagnosable, these psychopaths determine the future of our nation is beyond any comprehension. And yet here we are doing it.
They seem to have crept into every single nation in Europe, in the West in general. I mean, let's leave beyond that, you know, for another day. But in Europe, across all the countries of Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, we saw this in the COVID period, the absolute fanaticism of these guys. How did this happen? How did all these guys gravitate towards power, towards politics?
Well, it's interesting because, you know, we all know about the WEF and we all know about the Bilderberg meetings. We know about, you know, what I know is already disturbing enough. So I'm terrified to know what I don't know. But again, it's back to that original thing about somebody who's compelled toward power. It's the very reason why they should not be allowed near it. If you have a weak-minded, weak-willed man or woman who is sickened by the natural charisma and success of those around them, and they're nothing but a charisma vacuum themselves, and suddenly they're given the opportunity to become the bully in the playground, to become the big dick, they're going to take it, and they're going to be savage with it. And they're going to be psychopathic with it as well. No empathy, no interest in consequence. They know that within a couple of years they can jump ship and leave. Again, we got Pascal Donoghue gone. He's now with the World Bank with all the information about our nation. How is that even possible? We have Leo Varadkar, I think he's in Harvard, studying in Harvard, studying to be a new business leader. We have Simon Coveney. These were guys who held on to power with everything they had, and suddenly one morning they relinquished it. For what? There's no consequence. We have Mary Harney, our Minister for Health, for God's sake. She sits on the boards, I think, of 10 pharmaceutical companies. She was our Minister for Health. She sits on the board of 10 pharmaceutical companies with a massive annual salary for each one, plus 2 salaries herself. She's just gone, we have let these people walk among us, rob us, destroy our future, destroy our children, and they still walk among us.
You see, a couple of things that I noticed happening to politics down the years, at the macro and the micro levels. At the macro level, you had essentially the devolution of power upwards, out of, you know, so countries gave up their sovereignties, they handed it up to the EU or the UN or whatever, all the way up, right? That created a new layer above, which then was able to treat the layer underneath it as messenger boys. And that inevitably had the effect of deterring people of substance and talent and vision from going into politics, because they didn't want to be messenger boys. So the kind of people we ended up with were the guys who were happy to be messenger boys because they were going to be nothing anyway. But the idea of being messenger boys but driving around in big cars going waving to people, you know, it really appealed to them. You know, that was one thing that I think certainly had a profound effect. That had another effect deeper down in the kind of people who were attracted into the grassroots of politics on the ground. You know, that the political parties, you know, the commons, the local organisation, they tended to be not people of idealism, but just people who might have just as easily have been in the GAA, you know, painting the lines around the pitch on a Saturday morning. You know, it was all the same to them, really.
Yeah.
So that politics lost its visionary aspect as it became really a kind of a clerical position, really, in society that was nothing to do with anything. But then, what actually happened was that these people were given the roles of implementing tyrannies. And they, as you say, they relished that because they were such little people. That's just such honest. Like, you know, you just think about, you know, Simon Harris, Sean Lemass, discuss. How did it happen? Taoiseach Sean Lemass, yeah, it makes sense. You know, you can argue about his policies and all that, but he was a brilliant guy, a brilliant leader. Simon Harris, Micheál Martin. You know, like, and here we are in this, you know, after years and years of talking relentlessly about progressiveness, we're going backwards at a rate of knots, unprecedented.
Well, we knew that was going to happen. This whole DEI, the idea of defining anyone by their skin color, their sexuality, their genitalia, you just go, surely you know the inevitable outcome of that. It's going to create division. It's going to go full circle, and the very people who you claim to be trying to protect are going to be made vulnerable by it. Anybody can see that. And yet they rapidly implemented it. So across the board, all these things that they're implementing, the sex crime is up higher than ever. So they're going into schools, supposedly, again, these people who claim to have the moral certitude to be superior to us, they're going into schools to teach children about sex crimes, and yet the sex crimes are going through the roof.
Yeah.
So who's fucking doing what exactly?
Another one as well is the gender quotas thing, which has had the direct opposite effect to what they claim to have wanted, which is to elevate women. It now has created a situation where any woman in any senior position is treated with suspicion because she is assumed to have got this job on the basis of gender quotas as opposed to ability. And that has completely undermined the authority of women in positions of power.
Well, in terms of Irish film, I spoke to several female directors. I wouldn't call them female directors, I call them directors. Brilliant, brilliant directors. But female for the purpose of this conversation. And in Screen Ireland, they had this Waking the Feminist, they call it. It was started with the Abbey Theatre. It's a 100-year celebration of Abbey Theatre, and they had no female writers. So somebody with justification went, this is wrong. Women need to be represented in 1916, 100 years later. Of course, she's right. So they ended up including a couple, whatever, and they gave the theatre for the day to these women to step up on stage and air their grievances. And again, like in all these scenarios, the political ones were very aware of the moment and they grabbed it with everything they had. And the girls who actually needed it were forgotten immediately. But that's standard. That's nothing to do with gender. But now fast forward a short time later, Screen Ireland implemented the same policies. Nobody had any problem with Screen Ireland in relation to gender split or gender quotas. But they rapidly embraced it, and the president of the Screen Ireland, she wanted it to be her legacy piece. So suddenly we're now in a situation where I've spoken to these women, and they said they're horrified at the idea of being defined and reduced to their genitalia, and being reduced to a category as opposed to being a total equal as an artist. And yet they can't say that publicly because they would have their funding pulled in a heartbeat. So it's not just a case of people knew it was wrong, knew it was bullshit when they were implementing it, but nobody who really was horrified by it could speak out because they wouldn't be able to pay their mortgage next month.
Is something similar happening? Because this is something I don't personally understand. How feminists fought for equality for years and years. And now you have, you know, hairy arse men entering sporting competitions which were exclusively for women before, and, you know, necessarily and obviously so, and winning them and going around the place being congratulated and clapped, applauded by, and even by feminists. Some feminists, you know, only a small minority as far as I can see of feminists who say, nonsense, forget it, no, it's not happening. But it is happening. And we're only like a heartbeat away from a situation where in some event in the Olympics, you know, the 100 meters women's freestyle, blah, 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 whatever, 3 hairy arse men will step up at the end, up to the podium. One will go on the number 1 spot, one will go on the number 2, and one will go on the number 3. And they'll stand there proudly and everybody will go. Like, is that not the final derangement of our society?
Again, and this is not to shit all over people who identify as trans. And that's, as adults, if you identify as trans, I'd protect you. I would go down the line for you. But if you're somebody who identifies as trans, and by the way, I don't think it's trans people, to use that phrase, I don't think it's trans people that are causing the problem. I think it's trans activists who are an
Yeah, there is a difference, yes.
They're a malignant, malicious bunch of motherfuckers.
Yeah.
Whereas trans people...
But Kerry, also, there's an awful lot of people claiming to be trans who are there by virtue of contagion because of suggestibility as young people, you know, they're...
I remember we did it during lockdown. I did a speech, and I was again scared to do it. But again, I was so afraid. I thought, okay, you have to do it now because you're that afraid of it. But I talked about this unknown character, Barbie Kardashian, who'd been sent to Limerick prison. That was during lockdown. Now look at the consequence of him being freed, and the idea that there are women out there who's insisting that he is a she. And this is a man who has spoken publicly multiple times about his fantasy to rape and kill and murder women. And yet there are women out there who think it's more important to be ideologically on the right side of history by saying this man with a cock who wants to rape and kill women is a woman. The damage they're doing to women, the suffragette movement would just look at this and go, this is the greatest psyop in the history of humankind. And yet at the same time, we have men and women who walk around who are lovely people, who want to be somebody else. That's all fine. But why has this been brought into children's schools? Why has this been brought into government departments? Why has this been brought into banks? Why is this on every single street corner you see and in every building you enter? Why is this relentless, obsessive pushing of a trans agenda? It makes no sense to anybody on any level.
Except as a process of demoralization.
Of course. That's what I'm saying, is that it should lead to you asking wider questions.
Yes.
And unfortunately, the trans people, or the people who identify as trans, when this goes belly up, which it will, they're going to get the shit. Those poor people who are just trying to be people, they're the ones who are going to get the shit. And the ones who put it in motion are going to get away with it, as always, because they're behind the scenes doing it for their own agenda.
Yes. In the past, okay, terrible things happened now. And we tend to hear about the terrible things of the past more than we do the terrible things of the present. But, you know, terrible things happened in the past. But in general, you know, a lot of the things we talk about, whether it's being gay or whatever, they were dealt with in a very humane way in culture. I came to Dublin back in the 84 and I was astonished by what I was hearing, this idea that, you know, women had been roundly and systematically oppressed in Ireland. And because I come from, you know, background where there were lots of women who weren't particularly oppressed. I mean, my school headmistress was a woman called Mary O'Flanagan, who was the niece of Father Michael O'Flanagan, who was the priest who read the prayers in the first Dáil. And he was the Republican priest, the priest of the revolution, they called him. And she was absolutely, like, extraordinary woman, like, such as you would never believe if you listened to the radio and nothing else for the last 30 or 40 years. You couldn't have believed this woman could even have existed, and yet she did. She was completely independent. She had started her own school for boys because there was no school for boys, for secondary schools for boys in the town, and she had run it herself and with her sister, and she was extraordinarily powerful in her, you know, I've often said to people, well, to explain Mary, we used to call her Mary O, that was her name, Mary O. She was legendary. But I said, well, okay, imagine there's a dinner party, or no, a reception, a wine reception, cheese and wine reception, and for whatever, it's a new history book or something, and for whatever reason, Margaret Thatcher is there, and Mary O is there. And they just happen to drift across to the floor, and they end up talking to each other, and they start talking. So within about 5 minutes, Margaret Thatcher would be cowering in the corner, terrified of this woman. She was so smart, so emphatic, so clear in her outlook, so unapologetic in her expression. And she educated like the whole generations of my townspeople, boys. A few girls as well, but very few girls went there because this convent was up the road. So I kind of always find it a little bit hard to listen to this stuff and assume that all women were kind of, you know, under the table, terrified, you know. I don't think terrible things happen in all families, and all things happen, you know, in not all families, but in some families, in life, that's the way it is. But The idea that, you can universalize a personal perception and not allow for the fact that actually there's another truth, and other truths, multiple other truths there. That seems to be a huge thing at the heart of this kind of victim culture that we've generated. Which I remember talking to you, when the first time we spoke, I was telling you about the phrase which I used, which I'd come up with actually something like 30 years ago, maybe more, about what I sensed to be happening then. What I call it the culture of the omnipotent victim.
Right.
Brilliant
phrase.
And it's still there. Nobody's stolen the phrase yet. I wish they would, because it deserves to be stolen. I mean, lots of inferior things get stolen. It's a good phrase because the victim is now all powerful. If you run into difficulties with a victim, either as an individual or as a group, you're in big trouble. They'll destroy you. No matter how powerful you think you are, they'll destroy you. Unless you have a unique kind of power that somehow it relies on something more than simply your voice or your moral authority. Because that will be destroyed. They will destroy your moral authority, they will destroy your voice, they will destroy you personally, and they will put you in the skip of history. And I find it extraordinary that, this has been going on now for 30 years, creeping up on us. And yet, it's not recognised culturally as a thing that we've done to ourselves by licensing victimhood over all other characteristics, other descriptions of human beings.
What's even more disturbing about it is that professional victimhood does not require you to have been a victim. So actual victims have been replaced by professional victims. And what they're doing is, if you're a professional victim, there's nothing that you won't use to attack. And there's nothing that you won't use to justify your prejudice and justify your position. Because as a professional victim, that woman you described, your headmistress, she would be the enemy to the professional victim. They would despise her. Because they need to have a constant justification for their narrative right in front of them. So they reach for times in history. They put a circle around that and they said this was the history of the entire culture, which is horseshit.
Yeah.
I come from a working class background. It was totally matriarchal society. The women were amazing, fantastic human beings.
Yeah.
That was all we saw them as: brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers. We saw them, there was never any separation. And now we got older and we were told that we secretly hated them all along. We had an unconscious bias.
No.
Have you heard any bullshit like it in your life? Unconscious bias. The biggest scam in the history of modern language is unconscious bias. Because I can accuse you of unconscious bias and I never have to prove it, and you cannot disprove it. What a scam.
Yeah.
What a con.
Yeah.
And they use that across the board.
And the fact that you deny it, that's a primary symptom.
Exactly, yeah.
It's like the symptomless of COVID, Yeah. Like,
It's the trial. It's Kafka's The Trial in a simple phrase. Unconscious bias. I can accuse you of that now when it comes to race, when it comes to gender, when it comes to trans issues, when it comes to anything. I can accuse you of unconscious bias. And before we can progress in this conversation, you're going to have to agree to study a series of preemptive... Do you hear what I'm saying here? Because to make a film with Screen Ireland, you have to fill out a form, and the form is all about unconscious bias.
Whereas in reality, Terry, and this is, a generalisation, but it is an accurate generalisation, I believe. In reality, the differences in the treatment between men and women had all of their grounds and roots in biology, to history.
Yeah.
So there were two factors: childbearing and physical strength.
Yeah.
And so that dictated the work of the public realm. Mostly required physical strength, therefore men did it. Even now, after years of feminism, you don't see women doing the kind of dirty jobs that men do in the street. You do in other countries like Spain, for example. You'll see women cleaning the streets. You don't see that in Ireland. So there's that kind of sense of rewriting history. Because of the division of labour was based on biology, and women bore children, and therefore, I know this because I argued from 30 years ago for the rights of fathers to be given equal parity as parents, particularly in situations where the marriage or whatever had broken down, the parental relationship had broken down, and that they should be entitled to protection for their relationship with their children. The very same people who have pushed the gay agenda and all the other agendas spat in my face, almost literally, for raising that, and they still haven't fixed it. They've still refused to even look at it, and it's actually got a lot worse. So, this is we have been so duped about the nature of human relations in the last 50 years. To go back to this model that we're kind of drawing, and it's a pretty dismal picture. When you look at, you say, well, okay, take on the education system, let's take on the media, blah blah, all that. Yes, of course, but look at all the different elements that are completely skewed, and not only skewed, but invisibly skewed, so that people actually believe the opposite of what obtains.
Again, the complete subversion of meaning. We talked about the idea of what it is to be a man. Has there ever been a more maligned character in modern history than the straight white male? And the absurdity of that, the obscenity of it, the normalization of that obscenity.
Yes.
And it's coming from ideologically driven women and supported by ideologically incompetent men who want to convince everyone else that their lie is the truth. And their lie is a lonely lie, a broken lie, a rejected lie, a lie that makes them feel alive because it gives them a sense of import, a lie that gives them a sense of legitimacy. You're fucking lying.
Well, you see, this was an issue that I was really motivated by in relation to marriage, because I'd fought for years against the failure to provide for fathers who were not protected by a marriage contract. In other words, fathers who were either single and who constitutionally had no rights in Ireland whatsoever, and also post-marital, if you like, men who were either separated or divorced and found themselves basically treated in effect as de facto single fathers. People ask you, well, what is the purpose of marriage? Well, I believe it's a very clear purpose. It's not love, it's not, all these things are ancillary. The central purpose of marriage is to place the father in proximity to his children. That's the purpose of it. And to give him protections in that situation. And we brought in divorce, separation, all these things. We created a permissive society which resulted in more births out of marriage, which nearly half now, I think, in Ireland is coming up to. And did nothing about protecting that institution. On the contrary, we took a sledgehammer to it by diluting it and diluted it further in relation to, say, now we have inserted into the same articles which allegedly protect the marital bond of men and women. We have men and men and women, who neither of which, as couples, have an intrinsic capacity to procreate, and therefore don't need the protections which are there. But along with the addition of these extra categories, there is also the concept of equality, which means two men must be deemed to be equal to the man and the woman. How do you do that if they're so completely different? I'll tell you why. You work out which is at the lower level of rights, and you bring both down to that. And that's what's happening in practice, where the biological bond between fathers and children is now regarded as almost like irrelevant. Even the people I found when people fought those referendums, on our side, they would say, a child needs a father and a mother. And I would say, so the mother and the milkman. Is that what you mean? Or what? Do you mean a child needs his father and his mother, her father and her mother? Because that's a different thing. You see? And this is kind of taking the whole thing asunder. The thing is erect now, waiting for test cases to bring it to the level that will be measured by that dropping of the rights threshold almost to the ground. In a certain sense, you might say, given how chaotic everything else is, it's almost academic. It's just another area of chaos. But it is an area of chaos. And I try to draw attention to that many times over the last 30 years. But for that, I was ridiculed even then. I mean, I almost got pushed out of the Irish Times for raising these questions. There were delegations of feminists virtually every day to the editor's office demanding my head on the plate for things I wrote about family courts, male suicide, those kind of issues. I used to say to these women, don't you have any sons? No answer. They were preparing a nightmare for their own sons by their ideological approach to reality. They didn't seem to care. They cared more about trying to shut me up. So all this is kind of, I suppose, at the end, Terry, where we are. Like, are you hopeful?
Yes.
Good.
Very.
Really?
Yeah, surprisingly, because despite all the noise and the bullshit and all the accusations and all the screaming and the fallacies, I've had countless conversations with amazing people that I never would have gotten to talk to, and they never would have approached me if we hadn't gone down this crazy journey that we were on. And I find that those people and their children and their sometimes grandchildren have a sense of belief in magic and the future that might be even more profound than we had. Because when we were kids, we didn't really believe in a future or magic because everything was shit. And you just accepted that your life was going to be whatever this humdrum shit is. And these kids are dancing and laughing and pushing each other in a way that's, I find, electrifying.
Me too.
Really magnificent. And if they are the future, then maybe all our fuck-ups that we let happen, maybe they'll just sidestep it and show us how powerful they are.
And as for yourself, Terry, just finally, I mean, do you have a sense of history invading your life? By that I mean, I have this sense that, my life seemed to go on for a long time, just kind of come say gum sa, it's all just goes round and round and round. And then this thing happened in 2020. And I certainly didn't welcome it in any way. I hated it. I still hate it. And I still am appalled by it. And yet, it has caused my life to suddenly acquire almost like a screenplay sense of denouement, or of crisis followed by catharsis, or whatever it is that happens. That in a sense we are here at a moment in history. I mean, I'm a lot older than you, so I don't think I'm going to see the denouement. But I do think that we're actually here, those of us who are involved in this struggle, not just us two, but lots and thousands, maybe a few million other people in the West, all told, many millions maybe, that's our mission, is to actually prevent all of these issues that we've been talking about rolling together into one massive avalanche of horror and turning it around and actually restoring sanity of some kinds to humanity and to the world. Do you think that's real, or is that a bit conceited of me to think like that?
No, I think it's beautiful. But yourself, you mentioned in screenwriting, and the function of, again, just for your listeners, they might understand what you mean by catharsis in this context. Your life and my life in similar parallel in this regard. You suddenly are spun out of control. All the rails you were on that were fine, you're suddenly taken away and you're gone. But they say that in screenwriting, you have a major turning point in a screenplay. And it's where the character's sense of self and their place in the world is turned 180 degrees. And where of their own volition, the decisions they make, the actions they take, and the consequence of those actions means they can never return to being who they used to be. And they have forever altered their destiny. So catharsis in that context means that an audience gets to witness, vicariously, gets to witness the struggle of a human being and the hardship and the consequence of courage without having to do it themselves. But the seeds are sown in them to take those actions down the line. So the same can apply to betrayal or whatever you want it to be. We vicariously engage with the story, and the seeds of moral growth are sown in us, and we shine a light on that ourselves. So if the only fights you're ever going to get into are the ones you know you're going to win, you're not much of a fighter anyway, you're a coward. But I don't know if we're going to win this fight, But I know that it's a fight worth fighting for every day. And I know that the hope is that that little light you shine on it might be the cathartic seed that comes out in your daughter or granddaughter or whatever.
Let's hope.
Cheers.
Thank you.